Welcome, teacher friend. I'm Lori.
And I'm Melissa.
We are two literacy educators in Baltimore. We want the best for all kids, and we know you do too.
Our district recently adopted a new literacy curriculum, which meant a lot of change for everyone. Lori and I can't wait to keep learning about literacy with you today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Melissa and Lori Love Literacy Podcast. Today, we have an awesome guest. We have Corey Epler from the Nebraska Department of Education. And Melissa, I think he's a beacon of light for high quality materials for Nebraska. So Corey, welcome. You are a beacon for everyone out there working at all kinds of state departments, doing their best to get high quality materials.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks. Good morning, everyone. Good to be here with you.
Yeah, we're glad you're here.
Yeah, we have so many people that listen from Nebraska, and we hear so many good things happening in Nebraska. So we're excited to hear all about it today.
Yeah. And we should mention that when we had asked during our Morgan Polikoff standards podcast, we had asked and said, like, we would love to have someone from the state level. And then you had reached out, and we were so grateful that you reached out. So thank you for inviting yourself to be on the podcast. We're super grateful.
That's how it works. That's how it works.
Yeah, we love it.
The timing was really great as you all were talking about Morgan's book. And our staff had actually just been working through a book study with the book. So when you kind of did your call of, hey, are there any state leaders out there who are thinking about this work similarly, let us know. So I'm really happy that I'm able to join your conversation today.
That's awesome. Corey, I think it would be great to start by talking a little bit about Morgan Polikoff's book. And I mean, for some of our listeners who may not have listened to that episode, maybe give a little recap of like what made you all want to read that book, what you learned from that book, how you use that book, anything you want to share.
Yeah, it's really interesting because we spend a lot of time talking about standards, and we know that standards are important to guiding instruction. And over the last several years, the Nebraska Department of Education has really continued to evolve in our thinking about the place of standards in improving teaching and learning. Because I think a lot of times we start and stop with the standards at the state level. But what we've really been trying to do is to be more intentional about how we support the implementation of the standards, but then what are all the parts and pieces that actually guide instruction outside of state standards. And it was actually my math education specialist had participated in a book study using Morgan's book. And she suggested it for me to take a look at it. And as I read the book, I started thinking more about the journey that Nebraska has taken to improve not only standards, but also to expand access to high quality instructional materials and high quality professional learning. So it really mirrored the journey that we have been taking over the last 4 or 5 years. But I think it also really helps us think more clearly about how at the state level we can actually inform and improve teaching and learning in our classrooms across the state. So standards are one part of that, but there's so much more work I think that not only states can be doing, but districts can be doing as well.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I don't know that we've actually said the title of his book, which is Beyond Standards, which is exactly what you were just talking about, right? Of you can give standards, but that does not mean that there's going to necessarily be success in the classroom, because there are so many other things, especially, and we'll talk a lot more about it, but especially when we talk about curriculum, that need to be in place in order for there to be success.
Well, and, I think it's interesting too, because the other thing, my thinking has shifted over the last couple of years around the relationship to standards and to high quality instructional materials and professional learning. And I always say that an alignment to a standards document is a pretty weak tool when we talk about what should be guiding instruction, because many things can be aligned to standards, and that is important. I don't want to come across as saying alignment to standards is not important, but it can't be the end. And that's really where we've tried to pivot our thinking and saying, yes, we want resources that are aligned to the state standards, but there are so many other pieces that come out through a set of standards. And we've been talking a lot about the instructional shifts that are represented in revised college and career ready standards. And those aren't sometimes explicit. So when we think about our materials, our resources aligned to standards, the answer might be yes. But beyond that, how are those resources actually reflecting the type of instruction that we want to see in the classroom? So it's been a little bit of a shift for us, because I think from a classroom teacher's perspective, we just start with that alignment piece, but then we want to take it back up to that 30,000 foot level and say, beyond the list of standards, what are the types of shifts in instruction that need to be changing? And we saw that with revised ELA standards about 8 years ago. And I remember sitting with a table of school leaders, and it was about the time that we started doing a text-dependent analysis as part of our assessment. And we just had rolled out the standards. It was the first time we were assessing the revised standards. And I remember asking a table of leaders how instruction had changed as a result of the revised standards. And the answer was well, we're doing text-dependent analysis. And I'm like, no, how has classroom instruction changed as a result of the revised standards? And that was it. And so it really began to tell me that when we think about standards, they are a signal to the type of changes that we want to see happening in a classroom. But again, there's so many connected pieces to it. And that's something that in Morgan's book, he really lays out as well. So, not just starting and ending with the standards, but being mindful of all the other connected pieces as well.
Okay. So Corey, Melissa, there's your cat. Every time. You had partnered with CCSSO, and again, I'm not going to recall the acronym accurately. Okay. I can see the graphic. It's council and schools somewhere in there. But you had mentioned in our pre-call that you partnered with them about 5 years ago because you weren't sure what was being used across the state in order to get to that end goal, right, of coherence and agency and leadership, autonomy, authority, all those great things that we want to see in our classrooms. And when you ask that question to your leaders, how did things change as a result of the standards? And they really struggled to answer. I imagine that your partnership then with CCSSO was really valuable and helpful in kind of digging deeper and moving forward. Would you be able to talk a little bit about that stuff?
I think it was right about 5 years ago where CCSSO, the Council of Chief State School Officers, began working with 8 states, I think, as part of an instructional materials and professional development network. And before that even came to be, I had the opportunity to travel down to Louisiana and see what was happening in the Louisiana Department of Education around the supports that they provide for instructional materials. And it was really in that where it kind of clicked for me about the importance of materials in our teaching and learning system. I've always known they were important, but the way that the state there was able to leverage and be able to curate resources and help folks understand the quality was really appealing to me. And so when CCSSO invited the kind of first group of states to participate in this, I was really interested because in Nebraska at that point, we didn't know what was being used in our districts. From the State Department's perspective, we were really pretty hands-off when it came to curriculum and instructional materials. And in fact, I had staff that were like, no, we don't do that. And so we knew going in that we really had a lot of learning to do about, number one, what was being used in the state, how are folks making adoption, what are those processes look like, And then really being able to think more specifically about what types of supports we can provide. We are a state that doesn't have an adoption list, so schools can use whatever they want to use. So we really took it upon us to be able to understand the way in which we could provide technical assistance and support. And really the first way is we were able to leverage a great partnership with Ed Reports in this too. And Nebraska isn't a Common Core state, so we wanted to really make sure that Ed Report reviews reflected Nebraska standards. And then it was really a statewide effort to help folks understand the why behind materials and why the state was taking a more active role, why the state was asking districts to tell us what they were using. You know, there was a little bit of fear of, oh my gosh, there's going to be a list. But I think now, 5 years later, folks understand that what we're doing with this information is sharing it. You know, we have an instructional materials map where we can publicly display what districts are using and using it as an opportunity to collaborate across districts as well. So, and to the coherence piece, I think that's something too, because you know, we've really spent some time in our agency thinking about coherence across multiple parts of our agency, but even like our multi-tiered systems of support, which rest in our Office of Special Education, but when we talk about improving Tier 1 core instruction, we want to be talking the same language that our MTSS staff are talking to. And we know that students with disabilities deserve access to high quality instructional materials in a very strong Tier 1 instructional core. So same thing with our multilingual learners. So when we talk about how HQIM can play a role in supporting the coherence that we're working towards, it's really it becomes a no-brainer almost, right? Like, well, why weren't we talking about this before? But it's been quite a journey, and we're proud of the progress that we've made, recognizing that there's always more work to do in that space as well.
That's great. So I have like a million questions, but I'm wondering, you said that Nebraska is a state where, as a state, you're still, I don't want to say hands off, but kind of like staying hands off. The districts make the choices for what curricular materials they'll have in place. But that you wanted to sort of like shift the mindset around how districts were making those decisions. Can you talk a little bit more about how, like, what did you do? What are you doing to help districts make the best decisions they can?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've heard some really kind of crazy stories about how teachers felt that they were asked to participate in a selection process. Like, I remember one teacher saying, we were given 3 textbooks in 3 hours in a conference room and told to come out, what's our curriculum? And that's common, right? I even think about my own teaching experience where it was like, okay, here are your 3 choices. You have 2 hours, look through all these textbooks. And so what we work to really try to do is to create guidance around instructional material selection, and making that consistent across literacy, mathematics, science, and social studies. Like they each have their own nuances, but when we're asking educators to begin a process of selecting new materials, it's start with an instructional vision. Yes, they will be different for each content area, but that kind of first step is what we think everyone should do in all content areas when selecting materials. And so part of our work was, number one, like I said, creating that guidance about like, okay, if you're going to adopt new materials for mathematics, here's the 8 steps. And within the 8 steps, there might be subsets of this as well. And there's a lot of really awesome resources out there. I mean, Ed Reports has great resources. There's a curriculum support guide from instruction partners that we were able to leverage. When we get into talking about science, there are some really science-specific tools. So what we tried to do was curate them in one spot. So if a district calls me or I get an email from a teacher who says, hey, we're adopting new materials for science, where do I start? I can point them to our webpage, which is nematerialsmatter.org. And by selecting the content area, you can go to a tab that talks about adoption steps. And what's interesting in this is this conversation around quality materials and how we leverage ed reports. It's one small part of a process. So I think that was something too where districts are like wondering how ed reports plays into this. And we use it as a tool in our guidance for selection processes. So, all greens on ed reports are not created equal. I'm also really intentional about saying that something is green on ed reports. It's green on ed reports. I'm not saying green on ed reports means that it's high quality. And I've talked with the CEO, Eric, of Ed Reports and about that as well, because it doesn't take into consideration the cultural relevance of materials or how we've engaged with families and a community. So we want the tools and resources to be useful to districts and then guide them in how they can narrow choices and ultimately pick materials that are best for their students, for their families, and for their communities.
Corey, I love that you basically created a high quality resource list for your LEAs to select high quality materials. Like instead of them having to source that good, quality stuff and then work in silos, you created a way for them to be connected throughout the state and, maybe connect with each other. Like, hey, I'm using this from Any Materials Matter. And I found this to be really helpful. Like I imagine that created a lot of collaboration or at least communication. Do you have any examples of that or stories to share that you might be able to elevate?
Yeah, and we're really lucky here in Nebraska. We have a set of regional educational service units. We have 17 across the state, and our ESUs provide some of that support more directly than our agency does. So part of our efforts were really about how we can also support and connect our ESUs. So Nebraska's 8 hours from east to west if you're in a car. So it's pretty geographically large. And so when you think about if we have a district in western Nebraska using Wit and Wisdom, how can we connect them with another district in northeast Nebraska that wants to use Wit and Wisdom? And in many instances, it's through the ESUs that are able to do that, but also often it's just really making sure that those districts know that others are out there in similar positions. I would get questions about who's using Eureka Math. And prior to our work in this space, I couldn't tell you. And it's because districts wanted to hear the stories of educators that are using these resources. They wanted to hear the successes or the challenges of implementation. And so I think by being able to connect, again, not only our districts, but our ESUs, they're able to, expand the collaboration that might exist. And now with so many things happening virtually over the last 2 years, I think that's another really great success as well. And we've tried to highlight some of those districts on our website that have adopted, and we haven't even talked about implementation, right? Because that's where like the real work really begins. But just making sure districts know that they can connect with each other.
Corey, I have a question that you might not want to answer. So if you don't, feel free to say. No, I just was thinking about, there are still so many districts out there who are using curricula that are on ed reports that are not even green, right? You just said like even the greens, some of them aren't great, right? And we have a ton of districts, even here in Maryland, who are using ones that are red.
My daughter's. I won't say it. I can't say it enough. Yeah. My daughter's district. We are failing the children here.
So always in my head because of Lori. But I'm just wondering, you don't have to like say if there are districts in Nebraska that are using those, but I'm wondering like what do you do if a district is, wants to continue with one that's all red or is try adopting one that's not green? Like what happens in Nebraska?
Well, I think part of what we continue to do is to really try to educate not only school leaders, but teachers. And I can't say it enough that the power teachers' voices have in this process in advocating for higher quality materials. And what I found interesting is we have had a couple of projects where we were supporting some adaptation of materials that were yellow on ed reports. And what was fascinating to me is that the educators already knew where the gaps existed. And so when we had everyone collectively in a room, it wasn't a surprise. It was the places where they're going to supplement. And so, being able to leverage that time and energy in a more efficient way was really important. I think as we think about, and again, I'm going to mention Ed Reports, they're just a tremendous partner for us. What I try to get district leaders and teachers to do is to read the reports, first of all, and not just look at the green, yellow, or red. There are some really good yellow rated materials on Ed Reports as well. And so part of my conversations, if a district is picking something that's yellow on Ed Reports, is do they understand where the gaps exist? And that's really been clear in science lately, where especially on the assessment of three-dimensional learning for science, that's where some of the materials have fallen short. And so when a school leader can speak to that and then already be able to identify how they're going to supplement that, that's really important. The other piece too, and I have had conversations with districts who are using something that's red, and teachers may like it. They may have had great luck on it from an assessment perspective. My conversation then shifts more into subgroups, student groups, because if a leader might say, we've been using something that's red and we're having great results on assessment. My question then is like, what's happening in your student groups? What do we know about students with disabilities or multilingual learners, economically disadvantaged students, or students of color? Because I suspect that those student groups are the ones that are most impacted when we're using materials that fall short. And so while the big picture may look okay, that's again where I really start to push folks thinking a little bit about, HQIM for all means for all. And that sometimes can influence a decision. But again, at the end of the day, the districts that are adopting something that isn't green on Ed Reports, they understand that they may have to support some of the supplements that are needed. We did put, I will say this, one of the things that we did add to our requirement around ESSER 3 funds, because I know that many schools are having access to the federal funds from the pandemic, is we said if they were purchasing instructional materials that they needed to be high quality. And we've been supporting districts in that. And so I think we're just going to continue to see a lot of districts over the next year here in our state jumping to higher quality materials, which is really exciting.
I'm totally distracted scrolling through the website right now. You put together some really good stuff. So great work there.
Thank you. Thank you.
I looked at that map for a really long time. I was like, I want to see this like for the entire United States of like what districts are using which curricula. It's just fascinating just to see, just to see what people are using.
Melissa, can you verbally explain the map for those listening?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just you could. I was doing it by curriculums. I don't know if there are other ways to do it, but I could choose the different curriculum and just see which districts in Nebraska were using it. And so I just thought it was cool to see like the number of districts that are using it, and then I could start to see like if I was that district, I could then see which districts. I see it on Facebook a lot where people will say, are there any districts near me that are using Wit and Wisdom so I can come see it? Right. And I could see that they could see that so easily, which it's funny. Like, I mean, Lori and I worked at Baltimore City, the district. Lori worked at the state level. And like right now, we don't know what is being taught in the different districts in Maryland. Like we'd have to go to each district separately to ask. Just funny.
And it's such a powerful tool for collaboration. And
yes.
I'll say I also have gotten calls from parents, where the district may not have anything on there, and this is a self-reported data collection. So, or a superintendent will say, hey, our information isn't current. I'm like, don't forget to update it, and then we can make sure it's current on the map. But, when one of our regional service unit staff developers may call me because they're supporting districts who, are down to like 2 or 3, and they're like, can you help me find districts that are using Wonders 2020? And I have it in an Excel spreadsheet, but I'm also like, don't forget about the map, because you can actually do that. So yeah, we can search by the type of materials, literacy, math, science. We can search by district. And it is kind of fun just to see over 3 years how things have shifted also.
Yeah. I love that, even as a parent, I imagine that it's so transparent and honest, and it builds trust immediately. Like, from a parent, if I were a teacher, I would just feel so empowered. It reminds me of our recent podcast that we launched with Lacey Robinson and Andrea Hancock from Unbound Ed. And they were talking about the empowerment of teachers and how teachers, should feel empowered to lead from their seat. This would bring me so much empowerment as a teacher to be able to reach out to other teachers and other places, even within, my district. But I think it also really helps that need that teachers have, and I think we all do, to connect with others outside of our area. Like, what is happening elsewhere out of these 4 walls of my classroom or my school or my district? And I love this. This is exciting, and you should trademark it.
I appreciate it. Well, the other thing, Lori, as you're talking, I'm just thinking about, we have so many small rural schools in Nebraska, and it might be one teacher that is the entire department. So, thinking about too, how we can, and we ask that teacher to lead a selection process for new literacy materials. And, it's like, oh my gosh, where do I even start? Or what if it's a beginning teacher who's in like, their 3rd or 4th year of teaching? And so to your point about empowering teachers, I hope that educators could say, I could build a selection process and really, create something that's comprehensive, that engages educators and families and our community in this, and that everyone can feel confident in. That was our goal. So I really appreciate the shout out on that.
How many districts are there in Nebraska?
We have 244 public districts. So our largest district is the Omaha Public Schools with over 53,000 kids K through 12. And then we have some districts that have 100 kids K through 12. So again, you think about the variability of districts. But our goal is just to create supports that can be used across any size, and not only resources that are school leader facing, but also are educator facing too. Because I mentioned it before, educators do have a lot of power and voice. We want them to have voice in this resource as well, because they're the ones spending so much time supplementing materials that aren't high quality.
Yeah, and I think it just makes so much sense, like to have the teachers know what's happening, why they are making these changes, and have that voice. Because if you all came in as Nebraska and just said, these are the 2 curriculum that you can use, done, you know that that's not going to go over well.
Yeah, it wouldn't have worked.
It would be like trying to get a kid dressed for school in the morning. You get to choose from one of these 2, and inevitably they do not want to wear one of those 2 outfits, right?
Exactly. That's exactly right. Well, and I also say, I don't think it should work for us in this state, because our communities are so different. And the thing that I think is important is the materials market improves. Like, the materials are so different. And so what I love is hearing our leaders and our ESU leaders becoming experts in these different sets of materials, and then they can tell you the differences between them as well. And I think that's what a comprehensive selection process does. It helps folks really understand the materials that are available to them, and then again selecting the ones that make the most sense for their community. And that's reflected on our map. I would say, for literacy, when we talk things that are green on ed reports, we might have 8 to 10 in the state. And that's awesome. It creates challenges when we talk about professional learning, but I'm really excited that we have that many that are being leveraged in the state, and same for mathematics and science as well.
Yeah. So when you think about how you did that, like how you helped to transition this mindset, I know that you used Beyond Standards, the book that we were talking about earlier. Can you share a little bit about what that looked like? How did you use that book? What did everyone learn from the book that you feel like was really important that they could take with them then back into their districts?
For us, I think it shifted the conversation from just around standards to implementation. And one of the things that we've worked to do as we revise standards is really create clear implementation plans that are built over several years. And so, I think about districts as the state is revising standards. A district should also have a really clear implementation plan that includes a determination of if their instructional materials are going to be reflected in the revised standards. So I think my staff, as we were reading it, because we're the standards people, right? Like that's what we work on. So we're like, yeah, we feel really confident about the rigor and quality of our standards. Not perfect, let me say, but they are pretty good. And so when we shifted from just thinking about standards to really thinking more thoughtfully about supporting implementation of revised standards, and I think that's what the Beyond Standards book really did for us. Number one, it confirmed our thinking, but it also helped us think a little bit about some of the other pieces that we've started to kind of think about, but aren't quite there yet. For example, the assessment conversation, and not only summative assessment, but curriculum embedded assessments and how we can leverage those. So, that's a really important part. And the professional learning piece. There has to be clear support for teachers and leaders when new materials are being implemented. And the professional learning has to be material specific. We hear a lot about, come teachers, you get 2 days at the beginning of school and we're going to get into these materials and then you get to go teach. That isn't enough. And that's too where I think teachers have voice in saying, we need more professional learning that actually helps us implement these materials as they're intended, that shifts the observation protocols that districts are using. Like what do those walkthrough tools look like? How are they material specific as well? So I think that's where our head is thinking at the state level, but then again, that's what we're seeing happening with our service units and how they're supporting our districts and schools as well.
That's great. So that was my next question, was like, what's next? What's next in Nebraska? So it sounds like a little bit of a shift to talking about professional learning. And if you're okay with it, Corey, would love to hear a little bit more around the assessments and what you all are thinking around those.
For sure. Yeah, what's next? So the standards train continues to move forward here in our state as we're in the throes of revising mathematics. And what we did for our revised ELA standards that were just approved last year is we built out turnkey professional learning resources for implementation. The other thing that I noticed is I'm going to put rollout in air quotes. Folks might not see my air quotes, but here they are. So when standards are rolled out, I noticed it was very different from district to district or ESU to ESU. So we worked to try to create some efficiencies. And we developed 4 turnkey modules that a district could customize for their teachers, but really allowed us to be really clear about the instructional shifts, the connection to high quality instructional materials, and even the kind of nuts and bolts of what's different from one version to the current version. We're taking that same approach with mathematics and creating turnkey rollout resources that a district or ESU would be able to use. And then we're also in the middle of, let's not forget it, we've been in a pandemic for 2 years and trying to support schools in that way, but also trying to move forward with innovative changes that we had, been working on.
Yeah.
Our biggest one right now is around a summative assessment model that takes more of an interim approach instead of a summative test at the end. And that's something that Morgan talked about with you all on the podcast, but also in the book about, trying to create assessment that's more instructionally useful and can get teachers' data back more quickly. So we're in the middle of shifting towards that. We're calling it a through-year model. So basically next school year, our summative assessment will be 3 interim assessments, fall, winter, and spring, of which we can get a summative score, and districts will not have to take that summative at the end of the school year. It's very similar. We have a lot of districts using map growth, and so it's very similar to that kind of thought and the interim model. So beyond that, I hope we continue to think about building out curriculum-specific assessment resources. And our science specialist has been doing some of that with Amplify Science, and it's exciting to see how we can create assessments that are curriculum specific. It's just so much easier for teachers to pick up and use when they see how it fits right into the unit that they're teaching, and makes their lives a little bit easier, we hope.
And so much more meaningful, right? Instead of the we have to take this test for Nebraska for no reason, right? There's some like this is going to actually assess what we've been doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's tough because the other thing that it doesn't even take into account is there are some actually really great assessments embedded in these materials in HQIM, and we hear that on the K3 literacy side quite a bit, right? Where we have a reading law in place, and districts are like, well, we actually think the curriculum embedded assessments are better than the universal screener that we're using. And so it's forced some really interesting conversations about, that's actually a really great point. So how many times are we assessing students in grades K through 3, and what are they using for materials? And could we just leverage those really strong assessments in strong foundational skills programs? But it speaks to just this mindset of let's be efficient, let's support close to the classroom as we possibly can, and really continue to give teachers data that's most instructionally useful.
Yeah, in thinking about the assessments, I'm imagining that teachers, you're continuing again to build that empowerment for teachers by providing them with something that they can use right away. But I also, I don't know, in like a beautiful world, I imagine this trickling down to the students, and the students feeling like, oh, feels so much better to take a shorter assessments that is connected to what I'm doing. And then, rather than one assessment in the spring that's like 3 days long, there's no talking, there's so much pressure. And it's just not usable for anyone, versus these little assessments that are assessing smaller chunks of information or smaller topics, and it's connected to what they're doing, and everybody can use it, and the kids can feel empowered and just excited because they know some of the content, or they feel like, oh, okay, this isn't overwhelming, right? It's manageable, and then they're using it. They're seeing their teachers using the data from this, and it just feels so much better all around. That reflectively, I wonder how we got to the other way. I'm sure lots of things went.
Yeah, we hope it is, and because I even think, this idea of, can assessment not be a big event?
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, I see in the spring there are assemblies and all
Yes.
of that, and I understand the mindset behind it, but I think what we'd love to get to is where assessment's just part of like teaching and learning, and that we get data back in a manner that's useful to teachers. And to your point too, Lori, I'm thinking about families, like helping families understand the data and what that means, and the trajectory that students are on. And again, our system isn't perfect. We're still working, through some of the challenges of implementing something new. But I think in the long term, this idea of shorter assessments that are more frequent, that we can actually use for accountability requirements for state and federal is where we're going to start to see other states go as well. We know there's a lot of states that are having similar conversations also.
So exciting. You'll have to come back on once that happens and give us the little rundown of what has happened, in your state since then. That would be so cool. Thank you.
Happy to.
Yeah. Well, Corey, is there anything that we haven't touched on that you want to brag about that Nebraska's doing, or?
It sounds, cliche, but I just have been really proud to be a part of the work with our teachers and our leaders in the state, because I think we've seen really great momentum as we look at our data, because we have the data. We've increased the number of students that have access to high quality instructional materials significantly. And I would say even more importantly, expanded access for students of color, economically disadvantaged students as well. And that's really exciting, because often student groups that are historically underserved don't even get that as a starting point. And so, and I also say that HQIM is the floor, right? Like that's what we want to be, like the starting point. There's so much more. And if we can, get a baseline that is serving more students, that's fantastic. But we're always in the mindset of there's still more important work to be done. We can still always be better and continue to learn and support our schools and districts. That's really my hope, and the staff that I get to work with and lead as well.
Corey, I feel like one of the things you mentioned in the pre-call is the Louisiana mantra. I guess maybe it's not their public mantra, but it resonated with you when you took some time to spend, when you spent some time with them and learned from them and with them. Make the best choice the easiest choice. I'd love to just hear your thoughts on that as we come to the close of this podcast.
It makes sense, and I think the work that's happening in districts right now, there's so much hard work that's happening. And so if we can make districts' lives easier by helping them, make choices that aren't as complex and aren't as hard, because navigating materials and publishers is complex. And if a district doesn't have to start with 12 sets of resources to look through in a materials process, and they can do a deep dive into 2 or 3, that's what we want to do. So it's like, how can we make the best choice the easiest choice for our districts, and support them along the way, and make sure that the choices they make truly are reflective of the communities that they are serving. So yeah, that was a really kind of powerful statement that I've heard those in Louisiana say, and others in other states that are engaged in this work kind of adopting as well. So we hope we're doing that, and excited about the work moving forward too.
That's great. Thank you for that. And I think we're coming to a close, Melissa, right?
I know, it's time. No, thank you so much, Corey, for sharing all the amazing things that you all are doing in Nebraska and your districts are doing. We always ask our guests before we leave to leave a piece of advice for the audience. So we'd love to hear what you have for us.
My advice is always ask for help. And don't be afraid to reach out to others that are in a position that can offer advice or support. And, I think whether you're a teacher or a leader, is that there somewhere are people that have went down the similar path that you have. And so if you're sitting there and stuck and confused and you're not sure what to do, send an email, pick up the phone and call, because there are a lot of us that have been doing work in this space. And at the end of the day, we're all in it to help students and to support teachers. So just ask for help. There's so many great resources out there. Don't reinvent the wheel. It doesn't need to be reinvented. So that would be my advice to those kind of starting in this space.
That's good advice. Yeah, we're
take my own
constantly
advice
asking
too,
for help.
So. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you again, Corey.
Thank you. This
appreciate
was fun.
you reaching out to us.
Absolutely.
This was great to hear everything you're doing.
Well, thanks for all you're doing to elevate these conversations as well.
Thank you. And we'll keep Nebraska top of mind. I know they're pretty popular in our Facebook group, and they're very active on social media in general, elevating all the good things that are happening in your state. So we won't forget about you. We'll invite you to come back again. And thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Corey.
Thanks for listening, literacy lovers. We release a new podcast episode every Friday and share more resources in a newsletter on Tuesday. Sign up for our newsletter at literacypodcast.com. Each week, you'll receive important information, resources, and connected content.
We're excited to create a space for community discussion about our podcast. We want to connect with our listeners and support you in answering your questions. But we also realize there are a lot of other educators out there who have great advice and experience too. Let's keep learning together in our Melissa and Lori Love Literacy podcast Facebook group, and be sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter.
If the content in this episode helped you, share with a fellow educator and teacher friend. Our literacy lover community welcomes educators at every stage of their learning journey. We're so glad you're here to learn with us.